All and a very warm welcome to our Grades Without Exams event. I'm delighted to open this seminar, which is the second in our series addressing the extraordinary circumstances that we're all facing today in light of COVID-19. My name is Michael Charles, and I am a solicitor with over 25 years experience in education. And I know I keep on being told I say that all the time, but I have been doing education law for a long, long time. You may be aware that guidance has been issued by Ofqual, the regulator for qualifications, examinations and assessments in England, in regard to how really qualifications are going to be awarded in the absence of traditional examinations this year. This, of course, will have an impact on many students this year, particularly those in years 11 to 13. And of course, these are the years in which they are going to study for their GCSE and A-levels. I'm delighted to be joined today by our panel, some of whom you may already know. First, Shiroi Zak, who is a solicitor within our London office, and he's worked in public law for over 6 years now and has a particular interest in this subject. He studied politics at degree level and went on to pursue his ambition to become a solicitor, and ultimately became known as a key lawyer within the Legal 500 publication. And Shiroi is going to address consideration that is to be given for teachers and schools. Good afternoon, Shiroi.
Afternoon, Mike. Afternoon, all.
Chris McFarland is a senior associate solicitor operating at our Cardiff office. Chris has developed his expertise in education law over the last 5 years, securing success at High Court level within judicial review and within the special needs tribunal process. He'll be looking at what the considerations are for both students and parents. Chris, a very good afternoon to you this afternoon.
Good afternoon, Mike, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us.
Our guests today include Leon Glennister, a barrister from Landmark Chambers in London, described within the prestigious Chambers and Partners Directory as a rising star. Leon has gone on to be appointed to the Attorney General's panel of counsel and regularly acts as the Secretary for the Secretary of State in public law cases. Leon, a very good afternoon to you and thank you for joining us today. I think Leon will introduce himself shortly. Leon, are you there?
So, Mike, I think that Leon has found himself in some difficulty, and it's hopefully he'll be able to attend a little bit later on in the seminar in time for us to do the joint presentation. If he doesn't, I've got our notes and I'll be able to cover his side.
Oh, fantastic.
Hopefully we'll see him later.
I'm sorry, forgive me, because I didn't know. I've only just come on to this now without warning. So sorry for that, but Leon hopefully again will be joining us shortly. And as you will have seen, Charlotte Hadfield, who you may remember from last week's seminar, is also with us, a wonderful friend of this firm. Charlotte is a barrister who also heads the education law team at 3 paper buildings in central London. Charlotte, it is lovely to see you as back.
Thanks, Mike. It's lovely to be here.
Charlotte, and if Leon is here, will be talking about the potential avenues for appeal and any litigation that may follow as a result of the implementation of this and any other guidance that may be issued. Advice will also be given in regard to what parents and students may wish to consider doing now, because of course there's a lot to think about. We will not be operating a chat function today, but we do invite you to use the question and answer function, as well as asking any questions on the live Facebook feed. I will do my best to put those questions to the panel as they arise. To all of my panel, a very warm welcome. And without further ado, I would like to introduce you to Shiroi. Shiroi, good afternoon, and please tell us about the guidance and what you have to say about it.
Will do. Thanks a lot for that introduction, Mike. So as Mike says, I'm here to discuss what this guidance stipulates for teachers and educational institutions. I apologise in advance if there's any overlap with what you may already know or what you're about to hear, but the main areas that I'll be addressing are what factors schools and teachers are to take into account when calculating grades and providing exam boards with a student rank order in the absence of traditional exams, and the procedural and practical considerations that stem from what's contained within this guidance. In short, there's a grade calculation process that teachers will have to embark upon, and there's also a rank order of students that they have to provide in a class. That's to be signed off by 2 teachers and the head of the institution before it being sent to the exam board for a standardization process that the exam board will be carrying out. What that process is remains open for the time being, as they're currently consulting on that. I think that's something that Charlotte might be dealing with later in terms of potential challenges going forward. When calculating grades in the absence of traditional examinations, schools and teachers have been asked to take into account the full range of available evidence. Now, this gives them a relatively wide discretion in order to make what they say is going to be a fair and objective judgment of the grade they believe a student would have achieved had they sat their exams this year. The intention of the guidance is clearly for these grades to be fair and objective, but whether the guidance provides enough specificity to ensure that this is in fact the case may well be another matter. And as I say, that full range of evidence mentioned, it includes, but isn't limited to, non-exam assessments, the results of any homework assignments, the results of mock exams, and any other record of student performance over the course of study. Now, I'm by no means seeking to attack the professionalism of teachers here at all, but from what I can remember at my time at school, there were certainly teachers that perhaps favoured particular pupils, and there were certainly pupils that weren't particularly cared for by teachers. So from the perspective of a school, I think teachers really should be making a conscious effort to put any of those sorts of preconceptions to one side whilst making this proper impartial academic judgment. If this process is to be considered a fair equivalent to an examination where a student wouldn't be named and would simply be putting down a candidate number and being marked by an external examiner. I think that schools need to alert themselves to that fact quite early on, noting that there is certainly going to be room for that sort of inherent bias in the process, and that needs to be tackled head on by institutions from the outset. In addition to the grade calculation, the schools are then to provide a rank order of students within each grade in order to assist with the standardization process that follows. And to make sure that grades are fair between schools and colleges, exam boards will put all centre assessment grades through that process of standardization using a model that's going to be developed with Ofqual. And Ofqual state that they will consult on the principles of that model shortly, but they expect it to look at evidence such as expected national outcomes for this year's students, the prior attainment of students at the school, which is something that teachers will need to bear in mind, and the results of that school or college in recent years. So what teachers and schools need to bear in mind with regard to that is that if their grading judgments do appear to be more severe and more generous than those in other schools, or indeed in years gone by, exam boards will adjust the grades of some or all of those students accordingly. But a point that was of particular interest to me when I was reading this is that teachers and schools don't need to submit the evidence that they've used to come to their calculated grades. It does say that evidence should be retained in case the exam board has a query about that data, but it doesn't say the evidence must be retained either. It simply says it should or it ought to be. I think this may lead to a lack of accountability for teachers and schools. I think they'd be far more inclined to provide an objectively fair calculated grade and rank if they knew that their rationale and evidence had to be submitted alongside it and scrutinized along with it. But again, look, I mean, that's just my opinion, and perhaps I'm being a bit too skeptical about the process in its early days. Who knows? There are a few other points to note. Newly qualified teachers should be supported by their head of department throughout the process. It says should, again, not must. So in theory, an NQT with very little experience could be left to calculate a grade that directly alters the trajectory of a life. So schools need to bear that in mind as well, and try and ensure that NQTs aren't left in that position, and that the head of department does actually have some sort of role to play. What teachers and schools need to consider in particular with children with special educational needs and disabilities is that it actually remains to be seen, because there isn't much for teachers or schools in this guidance, or for anyone for that matter. The guidance simply says that schools and colleges will judge the grade that these students would have most likely achieved if they'd been able to sit their examinations with the intended reasonable adjustment in place. And that's all that it says. It's pretty clear to me that as it stands, the guidance is wholly inadequate. And I'd be interested to see what further processes, guidance, training, if any, will be provided to teachers in order to ensure that they can adequately predict the impact that the reasonable adjustments may well have had upon a grade. It's a very difficult thing to do. And if nothing else, I think that provision requires some further specificity. The Department for Education has also, of note for schools and teachers, confirmed that it will not hold schools or colleges to account on the basis of exams and assessment data from this summer. And that data should not be used by others, such as Ofsted or local authorities, to hold schools or colleges or teachers to account. Now, this guidance and any subsequent documentation will be deemed sound enough to hold students and pupils to account and judge them on the basis of their performance according to these criteria. So I've struggled to see why it's not good enough for schools and teachers not to be able to account. Again, this might just be me being facetious, but it may well lead to another lack of accountability on the part of those institutions, if that issue is nipped in the bud from the outset. With extenuating circumstances, teachers and schools are also asked to bear in mind that there may well have been personal circumstances which could have affected previous exams, i.e. mock exams and so forth. But again, it's difficult to see how centres can bear these things in mind, or teachers can bear these things in mind if they don't know about them. Because up until recently, a lot of parents may not have said that there were such circumstances because they didn't think they mattered. So I think schools and academic institutions might want to create provision for that to be put forward immediately, and perhaps write to people that go to the school and say, look, if there were issues that you haven't brought to our attention, please do so now, so we can bear those in mind going forward. And just to wrap up at my end, finally looking at this from a data protection angle as a school or a teacher, another thing that teachers have been explicitly told they should not be doing is disclosing the grade that they provide to the exam board, to any students or their families. And the guidance actually cites the data protection exemption within the GDPR that schools are to rely upon. And it says that data subjects, i.e. students, are able to request their personal data under Article 15 of the GDPR. However, in respect of personal data such as marks or other information processed by a data controller for the purposes of determining results, the exemption exists under 25(2) of the Data Protection Act, which allows the school to delay disclosure of such information until after results have been issued. Now, it doesn't say they just don't have to disclose it. It says it can be delayed until after results have been issued. So teachers do need to bear in mind that students may well be permitted to obtain this information and see what grade they were awarded by teachers. And I think certainly they should be provided with that information if they are going to appeal. But again, that may well be something that Charlotte touches on in terms of onward appeals and potential challenges. And I think that covers all of the key areas that I could spot whilst trying to, with some difficulty, operate through the lens of a teacher or a school, because it's not what I'm used to. But I hope that was of some use, and it provides you all with a slightly better idea of what's been set out within the guidance. We'll certainly be sure as a team to keep an eye out for any updates to this guidance, and perhaps deal with them in a future webinar. But for now, that's all from me, and I really hope you enjoy your Easter break. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sharoy. Thank you. We are having a number of questions coming through, and I'm not sure whether or not you can answer these now or whether we want to put them to Charlotte. But Sarah writes in, she says, what about children that have missed schooling, who've been home educated and been doing the GCSEs this year, and might have missed up to 2 years of their education in years 9 and 10, but only did one mock exam and no courseworks. But you know, what's going to become of those? I mean, Chris McFarland, you're going to carry on and give your perspective in relation to the guidance, and perhaps you can think about that question when you're presenting. Chris, over to you.
Thank you very much, Mike. And yes, you've struck upon there with the question a real key issue that I will go into very shortly. So, you know, for those of you who joined us last week, we had a seminar about the Coronavirus Act, and a lot of questions were given by some of the viewers there about GCSEs, A-levels and what have you, given the fact that the news had been announced that the examinations themselves would be cancelled and that then replaced with this teacher-based assessment that Sharoy just went into. And that's left a lot of people uncertain, that's left a lot of people worried, and understandably so. So from my angle, I've been looking at what the guidance that has been issued to students, parents and carers about this has said from Ofqual, and there's also a letter that's been issued by Ofqual as well to students. Now, essentially, it's explained what Sharoy is going to explain, or had explained, sorry, which is basically that the teachers are going to be tasked with reviewing all of the child's work or the student's work and coming to a decision as to, you know, what grade they probably would have achieved had the exams continued. Now, a very good question to ask, well, what if you haven't been in school very long? What if you're an external candidate? If you're subject to home tuition, or if you're a mature student who is learning themselves and just wanting to sit the exam at the exam centre. The guidance does talk about that. Now, it says for those who the school or exam centre are familiar with, then they may still be able to go through this grade calculation process that we've heard for your typical student, the one that's been at the school for a number of years. However, for those who unfortunately aren't known by the exam centre, Ofqual has acknowledged that it may not always be possible to calculate grades for every external candidate, although they will be looking at this in more detail and issuing further guidance in the coming weeks, so do watch this space. But obviously it can be quite worrying for parents and pupils who are in that situation. Now, one thing I would say is that they are being very clear that there will be examination periods in the autumn of this year and in the summer of 2021 to allow those pupils who are either dissatisfied with their grade through this standard calculation process, or of course perhaps those whose calculations couldn't be conducted because they're external candidates. So it is important to bear in mind there will be an opportunity to actually sit an exam, either if you're unhappy with the grade itself, or of course if you haven't had that calculation given. But of course, you know, who does this actually cover? You know, what exams are we talking about? Well, we're talking about GCSEs, talking about AS levels, A levels, extended project qualifications, and advanced extension awards in mathematics. At the moment, the guidance does not cover more vocational qualifications such as NVQs, although it does stress that it's working urgently to develop a similar approach based essentially on the same principles. So it's quite similar. It's very likely that a similar system is developed for those qualifications. So as Shiroi indicated, it's a little uncertain kind of in practice how this grade calculation process is going to work, and I think more crucially how accurate it's going to be. As Shiroi says, what if you aren't particularly liked by one of your teachers? I mean, I'm sure all of the audience members were well liked, but I can think of one or two teachers when I was in school perhaps didn't like me as much as I would like them to have liked me, certainly for the purposes of marking my work. And of course we don't have in these circumstances an objective answer sheet that can be reviewed or remarked. So when it comes on to appeals processes, which often do involve a review of the marks that are given to an individual student, that's obviously not going to apply here. So of course that does leave a bit of uncertainty. Now, from a school's and students' perspective, you know, there's also an issue of this grade standardization process, which Shiroi just explained. Now, what that actually means in practice is that the grades submitted by the school, college, or examination centre as a whole will be measured against its past performance and other examination centres within that exam board, and essentially they're going to weigh how harsh or how generous the marking has been in each institution. Now, one of the slightly problematic elements of this is that what if you're at a school and you're an incredibly able pupil, but the school itself is not a particularly good school? Maybe it's in a disadvantaged area, maybe it's just coming out of special measures from Ofsted or Estyn if you're in Wales, and you know, you're on to get your grade 1 at GCSEs or your A stars at A levels. Maybe you've got sixth form place waiting on these, maybe you've got a university place waiting on these, you know, so you're looking to achieve the higher grades. But what if you're the standardization of the school as a whole means that you get knocked down from a 1 to a 2, from an A star to an A, from an A to a B? You know, what's that going to do with your own prospects? Well, that is something that certainly we'll probably see a lot of appeals about. And I think that's one of the concerns that I have, is that when we're talking about standardization, not between students, but between schools and institutions, you know, what about those schools where they've just got a new head in? And actually, you know, I can think of a school nearby to me where for the last 3 years, we've had these banners outside saying, you know, record GCSE attainment. And of course, for those of us who lived in the area for a while, we know that's because the school wasn't really good and hasn't been good for, you know, decades, let alone the last 5 years. But over the last 3, it really has improved. Standards have really started to increase. So when we're standardizing that school, you know, are we looking at the trajectory that it's currently on, the year-on-year improvement in the last 3 years? Or are we perhaps thinking of that school over the last 10 years, over the last 5 years, where maybe it wasn't performing at the level of other schools? So does that mean that schools who have been performing better are going to get more favourable treatment to their assessments, and a school like that may not? Again, I think that's one of the big question marks that we have. Now, there is still more information to come on this, and the Joint Council for Qualifications, which is JCQ, which represents a number of very large exam boards in the UK, to include AQA, OCR, and of course WJEC for those of you in Wales. It also includes City and Guilds, has set out a statement confirming that evidence will be submitted by schools to exam boards in due course, and they will issue further guidance about this. The submission itself won't occur until after the 29th of May. But when it comes to the actual guidance from the exam boards, more information is going to be given after Easter. And they have said to follow them on Twitter if you want to stay abreast of that. But that should hopefully give us a clearer picture of, you know, what this means for students and what this means for schools in terms of standardization. Because obviously it's concerning enough, I suppose, for students that, you know, their teachers are going to look at their work, not even, you know, formal work, to include, you know, classwork and homework on top of their mocks, on top of their coursework to decide their grades, which might mean, you know, some students are concerned, well, I was doing great in my mocks, I was doing great in my coursework, but my homework, you know, maybe a little inconsistent handing it in, you know, maybe I wasn't giving it my all every single class assignment, although, you know, I'm sure there will be a number of good assignments for each pupil. So of course, again, what does that mean for those pupils? And again, for institutions, if we haven't been as strong as an institution for a number of years, maybe we're improving now, you know, what's that mean for us? Are you going to take our assessments of our individual students less seriously than others? So there are a number of questions. Obviously, you know, when it comes to appeals, as Charlotte will come on to, you know, there is anticipated to be a mechanism to appeal. It will look different than other appeal mechanisms that we've had in the past for these types of paper, but ultimately that's to be expected because you can't remark a paper that doesn't exist. And of course, there will be the ultimate backstop of examinations in the autumn and examinations in the summer of 2021. For those pupils who aren't currently are waiting to move on to university or to sixth form, those might come a little too late for those students. So again, there is somewhat of a concern about that, but it is an ultimate backstop that if you are dissatisfied, that will be something open to you. So we don't think that parents or pupils need to panic, but they do need to be vigilant. They do need to be keeping an eye on you know, the guidance and the future guidance that's going to come out over the next coming weeks after Easter, and they do need to make sure that they're bringing to the attention of their school, you know, any factors that may assist them in the calculation of the grade. As Shiroi said about access arrangements, if you're a disabled pupil and you have access arrangements, those must be taken into account in the calculation of your grade. And of course, you know, one of the things that I wonder about, having helped a number of pupils this year who are due to be sitting their GCSEs get access arrangements confirmed in the last couple of months, well, they didn't have the benefit of those arrangements for their mocks. They didn't have the benefit of those examination arrangements for their coursework. You know, how easy or how hard is it going to be for students to assess the benefit and the improvement that would have happened with those arrangements in place? I think it's going to be very, very hard. So keep watching this space. We will keep updating you, but there will be appeals mechanisms and there will be opportunities to sit exams. So don't panic yet.
Thank you, Chris. One of the interesting questions that came in on Zoom was from Kath. She says that my son is in an indie specialist placement, very bespoke placement, in which the cohort is extremely small and very varied, and he's the only one doing particular subjects that year. And she asked, what's the implications of this?
Absolutely, a really great question. And I think that ultimately the same process will take place. So, you know, Kath, your son, his teachers are going to be asked to look at the work that he's done on the course so far, look at his classwork, homework, etc., and obviously come to a calculation as to what they think his grade would be. Now, of course, when it comes to tiers of papers, you know, if you're going to go for a higher tier paper or a lower tier paper, the guidance does make clear that you will be graded within that tier. So you won't be in a lower grade tier and then get a first, as it were, or get an A. You will be graded within your tier. Now, in terms of him being the only candidate, what's that mean? Well, the same process will apply. But one of the slight concerns, as I said, about standardization is, you know, when you're talking about independent special schools where maybe many of the pupils there don't actually sit these examinations, it's going to be, I think, quite difficult to standardize those school scores, because, you know, you might not have a wealth of evidence of the last 5 to 10 years to say, hey, you know, pupils normally get these grades at that school because so few of them are doing it. So I think that is something very much to keep an eye on. As I say, the teachers there, luckily, because it's specialist, should have a really good understanding of what examination adjustments would mean for your son. So the teacher should know him well and should hopefully be able to be a good judge of his grade. But in terms of how the examination board treats their assessment, I think that's perhaps a bigger question. And we'll find out more once the guidance comes out.
Thank you very much, Chris. Charlotte, there's a lot, obviously, we as lawyers are thinking about here with this new method of assessment, and the kind of things that we can predict as best guess, really, based on our experience of these kind of episodes occurring, you know, in the past. Although nothing quite like this. One of the points that Hazel makes in a message on Facebook was that she's concerned there's a real potential for gender and race bias.
Yes, that's a really interesting question. I'm going to come to that a little bit later on in the course of my presentation, but I think that's got to be a genuine consideration. There's obviously some concern around disability discrimination and reasonable adjustments, but there's also a bit of a concern about data in relation to how predicted grades are affected by your race, your gender, and you know, other concerns like that, other protected characteristics like that. So that's a really good question from Hazel, which I hope I'll be able to answer a little bit in the course of the presentation. So I'll start by saying that the good news is that there is going to be an appeals process, as I think both Chris and Sharoy have said in their presentations. The precise ambit of the appeal process is still subject to further consideration by Ofqual and also subject to consultation, as in fact is the whole process. But the good news is that there is going to be an appeal process of some sort for students who are unhappy with their calculated grade. I suppose the first points that we need to make is that the first point that we need to make is that the guidance does accept that this is an imperfect system. So in the guidance from Ofqual to heads of centres, Ofqual say that they recognise that centres will have incomplete evidence and that the range and amount of evidence is going to vary between different subjects. And of course, it's also going to vary between different centres and between students. It's not known yet exactly how the system is going to account for that. But when we're looking at potential challenges to adverse consequences of whatever system is in place, that's obviously something that we'll need to have in mind. The fact that because of the timing of this and the unprecedented circumstances that we're living in, this isn't a system that's going to have been stress tested, and it is going to be a system where people are going to have to be picking up on errors as we go along. So it's far from ideal, and I think everybody would accept that, from the DFE right down to individual students. So who are we particularly concerned about? Well, obviously everybody who is caught up in this and is awaiting an exam result at this time is entitled to be concerned. The people who I think particularly stand out are students who are disabled and require reasonable adjustments. And what the guidance says about students who require reasonable adjustments is that where there are students who have agreed reasonable adjustments, which could be something like a reader or a scribe, or some other agreed access arrangement, the judgment on their grade should take account of the likely achievement with the reasonable adjustment in place. And so when the calculated grade, well, or rather when the data that will go towards the calculated grade is being considered by centres, they need to take into account how the reasonable adjustment would assist the student in taking the exam. So if you are disabled, looking at what you can do now, if you are somebody who has a disability, firstly, you really need to let your school or college know as soon as possible that you have it. You need to tell your school and college very clearly how it affects you day to day. You need to tell them exactly what arrangements or policies or processes that they have adopted, whether that's in relation to past mock assessments or the way that classes are taught, or anything in the way that education is provided that has put you at a substantial disadvantage compared to students who aren't disabled. And you need to be really clear about what those policies and processes are, and you need to be clear about how that has put you at a substantial disadvantage. So what is it that about that policy or arrangement that puts you at a particular difficulty compared to people who are not disabled? And then you need to say, of course, how you think the centre needs to take action in order to remove or mitigate that substantial disadvantage. So that's all Equality Act territory. It can be very technical. It's really important to be crystal clear about it as quickly as possible, because obviously here we are in April talking about a process that is going to take place over the next few months. So if you think you have a disability, you really need to let your school or college know as soon as possible. The second issue, obviously, is for students who haven't suffered a disability but who, for some other very compelling reason, weren't able to take assessments previously or have suffered some sort of traumatic event that has either stopped them from taking assessments or mock examinations, or has caused them to miss a lot of their course, or has just made it much fully participate in the course. Now, special reconsideration requests won't apply, so it's not going to be like a normal exam situation where you can put in a mitigating circumstances form or a special reconsideration request. And so you just have to make sure, again, that when your school or college is looking at your at the data in relation to you, they are fully aware that something like this has happened. So that means informing the school, providing them with evidence, being very clear about how it has affected you. Now, there's also, obviously, as Hazel, I think, raised, the issue in relation to homeschool distance learners and independent learners, which I'll come on to a little bit later on when I look at the algorithm that's going to be used to calculate the...
Charlotte,
Yeah.
I'm awfully sorry to interrupt you. The reason I interrupted is it just seems the right time to raise Sarah's question, because you talked about the no special consideration problem that exists, and she says that what about children that have been home tutored with the local authority and doing GCSEs this year, missed 2 years of education throughout years 9 and 10, and only ever done one mock exam, never had any coursework, but has the ability to get a grade B or even a grade A in their exams?
Well, the short answer, I'm afraid, is that at the moment the guidance refers to that as an issue but doesn't really give any helpful indication as to how it's going to be dealt with. So what the guidance says about that, effectively, is that it is recognised that that is an issue and they're consulting on it. But obviously it is going to be a concern. It's not just children who are being homeschooled. Obviously, it's also going to be an issue in relation to external candidates. So some people will take a subject that isn't routinely offered at their school, and they might learn independently, or they might have a tutor preparing them for it, or they might have they might be an independent learner who's just deciding to do home study. Really difficult to know how an algorithm is going to do justice to those students. Now, in relation to students who have been homeschooled, there is likely to be some data, I would have thought, that would be available in terms of how they're doing. And I assume that following consultation, Ofqual and the government between them are going to come up with some sort of system whereby that information and data can be taken into account. But I have to say, at the moment, the guidance just doesn't really say anything very helpful about it. It's a possibility, I suppose, that those students will be told that they need to take their examinations at a later stage when things are less restricted and the lockdown has been lifted. But at the moment, I'm afraid, Sarah, we just don't know what the answer to that question is. What we do know is that the government and the and Ofqual are not ignoring it. They understand that it's an issue. So a certain amount of comfort there. It is very unlikely that there will be nothing in place for those learners at all. In terms of what will be in place, we're just going to have to wait and see. So I suppose the big question is, well, how is an appeal system going to work? Because the appeal is going to be the main route of redress for students who want to appeal. And given that all of the students who are affected by this regime are students who need their grade because they're going on to their next stage of education, or because they're going on to a new institution, perhaps they're going on to higher education or further education, the likelihood is that there are going to be a lot of students who will be very directly concerned if their calculated grade either doesn't give them what they need to move on to that stage, or is significantly below what they were expecting they would get. So we're expecting that there's going to be a substantial number of appeals. Again, the guidance doesn't say much about what the appeal process will be, apart from that there will be an appeal process. What they do say is that the appeal process is going to be fairly narrow in terms of the grounds that you can appeal on. Well, we don't know exactly what that will mean yet. They say that it will be restricted to the application of the process, which presumably means that they're trying to avoid a lot of evidence about what has happened outside of the way that the grade's been calculated. But to some extent, we will have to wait and see. I think Shiroi raised the question earlier, what information will students be entitled to if they want to appeal? Well, obviously, if you're going to appeal, you're going to need to know exactly what it is that your centre said about you, and you're going to want to know what your centre's opinion was based on. There's obviously a wider question in terms of how far it's going to be possible to go into whether the academic judgment of the centre was correct or not. because historically, of course, we know that the courts have been very reluctant to interfere with academic judgment unless there's something like discrimination or bias or some other form of prejudice at play. So Ofqual's guidance to heads of centre suggests that the data in terms of the suggested grade and rank of the student can be shared after final results have been issued, and that is consistent with the Data Protection Act 2018, which permits withholding data until 40 days after results are announced. The guidance also says that centres should retain supporting evidence, and so obviously Shiroi raised the question of, well, how definitive is that? But hopefully if the guidance says that centres should retain it, they will. What's not really clear is how much of the underlying data students will have at the point where they need to make an appeal. And if they don't have all of the data, including both the suggested grade and the rank, obviously that would make it difficult to put forward a fully comprehensive appeal. But we'll have to wait and see, because that's subject to consultation. In terms of grounds of appeal, I've already said we don't know how far it's going to be limited in terms of academic judgment. As Shiroi said, what if you didn't get on with your teacher? Is that going to be something that you can raise as an issue? Are you going to be able to get a second opinion on what your results show? What the guidance does say is that if you disagree with your calculated grade, you'll have an opportunity to retake the exam in August and also in 2021, as I think Chris said earlier. What they also say, though, is that both grades will stand. So it's a bit like doing a retake. If you retake your GCSE because you didn't get the mark you got last time, you would have both marks on your record, but you would be able to show, hopefully, that your second grade was better than your first. That's fine for retakes, because in both situations, the student has taken the exam, they've hopefully had every opportunity to prepare for it, and you know, exams can be difficult, people can have off days. It's a little bit more complicated in a situation like this, where students didn't know that their non-exam related, non-coursework related work might be taken into account in calculating their grade, and they haven't had a chance to actually take the exam and show what they can do. So, you know, there are probably going to be a lot of students who, if they're disappointed in their calculated grade, will feel that they haven't had a fair crack of the whip. And then the question arises, well, is it really fair if, for example, there's a problem with the algorithm in respect of a particular student? Is it really fair for that student to have to show both grades on the record, where one is the result of perhaps a speculative and not terribly well judged grade? Hopefully the algorithm will work well for the majority of students, but we don't know, because we don't know what it will consist of yet. So far as the algorithm is concerned, we know that centres are going to be using a statistical methodology in conjunction with Ofqual, and that Ofqual are working with technical experts within exam boards and others to develop a model. So that's to be consulted on. Algorithms work the way that algorithms work is that they do the best for the majority of people, or for the most people. So for example, if we look at the way adverts work on Facebook, those are dictated by algorithms, and sometimes you'll get adverts that are relevant to you, and sometimes you'll get adverts that are terrifyingly irrelevant to you and make you wonder what Facebook thinks you're doing. So an algorithm is often right, but it's sometimes wrong. It's not necessarily the most transparent way of approaching something like this. And there are inevitably going to be questions as to how it works. And that really is the concern, particularly in respect of disabled children and students, homeschooled students, distance learners and independent learners. Ofsted is consulting on this, but we're going to need to keep an eye on that, given the data that Ofsted is currently saying it will need. Sorry, Ofqual is currently saying it will need. So here we've got an algorithm that won't have been stress tested, which has had to be developed in a very short period of time. In terms of categories of who gets a grade, I think we had a question on the Q&A from K22, hello K22, whose concern is that year 10 pupils are currently under an awful lot of pressure. Just to put your mind at rest, K22, it doesn't look like year 10 pupils are going to be part of this exercise. So what the DFE has said is that grades should be submitted for all students in year 11 and above, including students taking A-levels in year 12. So that's consistent with the rationale that the current system is to let students progress to the next stage of their education, although obviously with year 12 students, not all of them are necessarily doing that, so there's a slight inconsistency there. But it looks as though, subject to consultation, years 10 and below won't be having grades submitted for them, because they'll have the opportunity to sit exams in future rounds. Turning, Mike, to the point that you raised about discrimination. I've talked a little bit about disability discrimination and what you can do now. There's a wider concern, as I think has been pointed out, in terms of the effect on students from disadvantaged backgrounds, for example, from some minority groups, disparities between genders in terms of how their grades are predicted. So we know, for example, that students from disadvantaged backgrounds are more likely to have their grades under-predicted than other students. Now, what the government says in relation to this, because the government, to its credit, has mentioned this, has not pretended it doesn't exist, but what the government's guidance says effectively is these aren't just predicted grades being internal predictions made by subject teachers in respect of the students they teach. This is, the government's effectively saying this is going to be a more fair, more objective process, taking into account a broad range of evidence. And they say that Ofqual will make every effort to ensure that the process does not disadvantage any particular group of students. We don't know how they're going to do that because they haven't said how they're going to do it in their guidance. But one thing that Leon and I did identify is that somebody's going to have to do an equalities impact assessment here. So somebody is going to have to identify specifically how whatever regime is adopted might impact people with particular protected characteristics. So the results of that are likely to be very interesting. And if that equalities impact assessment is not done properly, that potentially is a separate route of challenge to an unfair system. I think at the moment, Mike, that's probably all I can say by way of presentation, because so much of this is subject to consultation and the devil's going to be in the detail. But the guidance certainly makes for really interesting and, of course, from a student's perspective, in some respects, quite anxiety-inducing reading simply because of the lack of clarity around it.
Yes, thank you. Thanks very much, Charlotte. I mean, a number of the questions that are coming, you probably wouldn't have seen these on Facebook, but Dave and Charlie have got very similar questions. In fact, there's quite a number of questions all around the same real point, which is we've talked about earlier. But the concern that's being raised is the cut-off time, you know, when the people are doing courseworks and they're about to finish and their best piece of work is about to come.
Yeah.
They've been, whoom, the guillotines come down, they've got no chance to better their performance. And there's real worry about that. Is there any sort of reassurance that any of the panel members can give to those people who are worried about that?
Well, sorry, I'm just going to dive in because I happen still to be unmuted. So what the guidance says is that there is, firstly, and perhaps I hope reassuringly, if the guillotine has come down just before you were about to submit something that would have been critical, you're not going to be penalised for that. The guidance is quite clear that students should not be penalised for not completing work because the announcement was made before they could. What the guidance also says is there is no requirement on centres to set work for students in order to give them, if you like, a paper trail or a portfolio, if you like, of work that can be submitted for this. And in fact, what the guidance says is that centres should be careful about doing that. I think that's probably because there is a slight concern about, I suppose there might be a concern about, for example, if you say, well, let's just set a mock exam that's a bit like a GCSE or an A-level and see how people will do. How are you going to ensure that they are being carried out under examination conditions at home? The likelihood is that some people will stick to the examination conditions and some people won't, and some people will be somewhere in between. But having said that, it seems to me, firstly, that's subject to consultation. It seems to me that individual centres with individual children and students are going to have to make some sort of judgment call about whether they have enough data for to be able to put forward a proposed grade. And so some centres might find that they do need to at least give people the option of doing some extra work, although the guidance doesn't seem to approve of that as a potential way forward. Certainly for disabled students, I would have thought that potentially it would be a reasonable adjustment to allow them to do that, if their portfolio otherwise would lead to them getting a grade that isn't as high as perhaps their centre feel they can achieve.
Thank you again, Charlotte. Thank you. I mean, the questions are coming in thick and quite fast. and a number of people are worried about the fact that they missed the first part. I mean, so my message to Clotty and to I think it was Jane who wrote, "Eek! I wish I caught this from the beginning. I'm going through this right now, and I wish you don't need to worry because, in fairness, this will be you'll be able to replay this this bit later. But for the sake of some people who have expressed some concern, I'm just going back through some of the questions. But some people have asked. Emma, for example, has asked that, you know, how far do you go back? when you're evaluating, if you haven't got the up-to-date picture, how far do you go back? Is there anyone who can give us some help on that?
I think this is the issue, isn't it? Because the guidance does give schools and teachers a relatively wide discretion. It says they can basically take into account any relevant performance data, and it does then sort of come down to the individual teacher and school as to what they deem to be relevant. But one thing they do need to bear in mind is if they do go so far back that it is most likely to be considered irrelevant, one, they might be held to account in some form of appeal, but two, if the exam board does get in contact with the school and says, well, actually, could you just give us what the data that you based your decision upon, because you are meant to hold it. Schools and teachers do need to bear in mind that they will be held to account on the basis of that decision-making process. So the answer is they could go as far back as they deem to be relevant, bearing in mind that someone may well call them out on it. So I'm hoping that they'll make the right call with regards to what they consider when they're making these decisions.
Another very interesting point that's been raised by Joanne on the Q&A is that she's worried that some children, of course, who've got real apprehension in relation to examination might say, oh God, I'll take anything. Give me any grade and that will do. And I can fully understand that some parents be really worried about that because, of course, you know, not always at an age of around 16 do you necessarily look very far into the future. You don't really realize the significance of the grade until much later, when you realize later in life, oh God, that would have made a big difference. So, I mean, is there any advice or some guidance that you can give to Joanne in relation to that? Because she says that she's very worried about that because, you know, she's concerned how he could sit in an appealed exam, for example, if that were the situation.
Well, I think that'd fall kind of in the discussion that I had about students. I mean, you know, for those students who maybe hate exams, and I'm not quite sure how many students really love exams, so it might be every student. I mean, you know, it comes down to how satisfied you are with your grade. You know, if you actually think the grade is pretty fair, and you would be pretty happy with it, then certainly you can accept it and you can move forward with that. If you're dissatisfied with it, then the guidance does make clear that they will be arranging these reassessments in the autumn and in the summer of 2021. And one of the good things about that is, you know, when the exam board and the exam centres, so this should be arranged by the exam centre, which is basically the school or the college that your son currently attends, Joanne. So when it comes time for him to get his grades in August, if he'd like to have the opportunity to sit that exam, he should let the school know. And what the good news is that they say that both grades will stand. So if, let's say, for example, you had an A and you wanted to go for an A star and you think, oh, I really think I would have got an A star, so I'm going to go back next year, you know, even if I can go on to university this year even, I'm going to go back next year just to sit the exam, try and get that A star. So it looks great on my CV. You know, if you go there and perhaps you don't perform as you expect and you get a B or a C or even the same A that you had, you know, both grades are actually going to stand. So it gives those students who really do just want to sit another exam to give it their all, that safety net that you're not going to get a worse grade than you had before. That grade you were given by your teacher is going to stand. So, you know, it's going to come down on a case-by-case basis. Of course it is. It's going to come down to the individual student, what they need and what they want to progress. But it does give them that opportunity to push a little harder and not worry too much about the consequences if it doesn't go right.
Thank you very much, Chris. Lindsay just asked a question. She says, what if you can't go back at all? And my child has only just recently went back to do GCSEs, English and Maths, after a period of 4 years of limited education due to ill health. The tragedy there is that she's extremely bright and she would have reached her grade, but she's worried that they won't give her, they won't really have a proper picture of her performance. Given that, any assurance or advice you can give to Lindsay in relation to that, anyone?
It's difficult to say, I suppose, because so many cases are going to depend on what information is available about the individual. I wouldn't necessarily say, I mean, it is genuinely very difficult, actually, because, you know, is a year of schooling going to be enough? Let's say you come in to start your GCSEs and you've done, perhaps you came in a little bit late and you've done 1 year. Is that going to be enough? 1 year of A levels? Quite possibly. Many teachers would say that it is. It's probably enough for a good teacher to get a feel for what you're capable of. I suppose the difficulty comes in when you've got, I mean, there's a huge spectrum, isn't there, between, on the one hand, the very bright student who, through circumstances that are no fault of their own, has just not been able to access the schooling that you would hope that they would, but who still would have made the grade, which is the kind of situation that Lindsay's describing. And then on the other hand, the student with bags of potential who perhaps has coasted a bit through the year because they know that they do well in exams and they've not worried too much about mock exams or about classroom grades because they have been told all the way through, well, this is going to hang on the examination. You know, so in one circumstance, you'd say, well, you would hope that the system is going to be flexible enough and responsive enough to say, we need to make allowances for Lindsay's child to make sure that they get the grade that they deserved. And in the other circumstance, you might say, well, look, yes, it's unfortunate that everybody was led to believe that their classroom attainment wouldn't matter much for the exams, but we're in an exceptional situation. And unfortunately, there is still, even in normal times, an expectation that you'll do your best at school. So it's sort of trying to navigate, you know, for teachers trying to exercise their academic judgment to navigate between those two extremes.
Thanks, Charlotte. Olivia raises quite a sad point, really, a sad point for her, really, that she says that she's a private candidate and she's been privately taught by a tutor for the past year, was due to sit her A-levels this summer. And the Board of Examination recently advised that they won't be able to predict her grade and that she will have to instead sit her exams in 2021. I mean, that is really quite unfortunate. She would have spent a lot of money, no doubt, pursuing that, and she now has to wait another year.
Yeah, well, we'd want to know why, really, wouldn't we? I mean, ideally, you'd really want to know. Well, you know, you've had a year or 2 years of input from tutors. What have the, you know, what information is available, and you'd really want to just understand exactly why it is that people are saying you can't predict a grade from that.
Yeah, because my initial reaction to that would be, why can't the tutors be asked to give a view?
Yeah, that's what I'm wondering. There may be a very good reason, but it's the obvious question, isn't it? Well, you know, is there data available in relation to this person, and if there is, what's the problem with using it?
My apologies to Gemma, who wrote in. I don't really quite understand the question, but I'll just raise it just in case someone can or does understand it. Can a child with a PAB have a TA come to our house instead? He's an independent school and the only child there with an EHCP. I'm assuming she means PEB is a personal educational budget, is it? Assuming that's what she means. Don't quite know what that question has to do with the exams, but maybe someone can take a guess.
No, I think it's perhaps more based on what we were talking about last week in terms of the ongoing duties on local authorities to meet the needs of those with plans. I mean, like we talked about last week, and I'd highly recommend that she go back and watch that seminar. It may actually answer her question, and it is on Mike's Facebook page and on our website if Gemma would like to do that. But I think that in terms of having a personal tutor or a one-to-one tutor come to the house, obviously there are risks associated with that, obviously with the current virus in place, you know, but there isn't an obligation on local authorities still meet those needs currently under the Children and Families Act. So the answer is, can you have a one-to-one given to you at the house? Yes, you can. Will you be able to find one in the current circumstances? Will that necessarily be safe for your own family's personal circumstances? Well, that's unfortunately a matter for you to decide. It's a little too specific for this seminar. But if you do want to get in touch with us, do email us at education@sinclairslaw.co.uk. And with a look at the papers, we'll probably be able to help you out.
Thank you. Thank you, Chris. Yes, that's exactly right. And just to recap, that this seminar can be viewed all over again if you want to see us all again. On Facebook, and will be on shortly on our website at sinclairslaw.co.uk. And of course, as Chris quite rightly mentioned, if you have any queries, you just don't know, you're a bit worried, you're concerned about your situation, whatever that situation may be, drop us an email, education@sinclairslaw.co.uk. And I would like to really take this opportunity to thank all of the panel who took their time out this afternoon. And Chris, I know it's your vacation. I think you're having a vacation today. Are you going on holiday to the kitchen, Chris? That's what I want to know.
That's right. I think we're going to start in the kitchen, and we've actually put a paddling pool out back as well. I was meant to be in Florida with the kids this week, a big family holiday, but instead we're going to settle with Disney Plus instead of Disney World, and a paddling pool instead of a hotel pool. But we're making the most of it, and luckily this seminar wasn't interrupted by two feral children excited for Easter, so that was an extra bonus.
Thank you, Chris. Well, thank you to all of our panel for taking their time to answer your questions this afternoon. And thanks very much to Shiroi and, of course, Chris. And a very special thank you again to our guest, Charlotte. I'm very sorry that Leon wasn't able to make it, but we do sincerely thank you all very, very much for watching. And I do hope that you found the session useful. I've got something really good in store for you now for next week, though, because I'm delighted to say that we have a very special event next week. And I will be joined by a panel of some of the UK's leading experts. And they really are. And these are experts in special educational needs. We will have Vivian Clifford, an educational psychologist. We will also have on our panel Juanita Hurley, a speech and language therapist. And we will also have Melinda Erickson, an occupational therapist. And they will all be joined by David Lawson, a barrister from Sergeants' Inn in London, who specialises in special educational needs in the law. And this seminar will be the third in our series of COVID-19 presentations. And we'll be addressing some of the really important points that are vitally important to you now involving children at this particular time. I mean, for example, we will be discussing things like children in isolation, how are we going to support them? And how do we prepare them for the transition? They've missed so much now. I mean, some children, of course, you know, you take a child who's not going to be sitting GCSE or A levels, but really need to acquire good life skills. I mean, and this is a vital part of their of education that they're missing. And we'll be talking also about how these youngsters will transition back to school and the potential problems that that will create. And of course, the frustrations, the lapse in performance and the academic and social lapse in performance for the children in question. And of course, we'll be going on to talk about assessments during the lockdown period and how these are going to be conducted and how we can perform an occupational therapist, speech and language therapist, or an educational psychology assessment. And of course, I'll be here also with David Lawson to address any legal problems, including, of course, some advantages. And I've got some points that you might be impressed by, because there are some advantages with this current situation. I know it's hard for you to imagine, but there are, I can tell you. Wait till next week and I'll tell you about that. We should also be addressing the questions, as always, live from the audience. And that will be the event that will be on next week. And it will be on the 17th of April at 3 o'clock, here again live. And until then, well, that only leaves me to say, have a wonderful Easter weekend, and please do stay safe, and very goodbye to you all. Thank you very much.